Presented by Caltech.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's seminar. My name is Diana Buchwald. I'm in the Division of the Humanities and Social Sciences here at Caltech. The William and Myrtle Harris Distinguished Lecture Series in Science and Civilization celebrates already its 22nd birthday. It originated in 1996 with generous support from the Harris family, whose interest and contributions to our activities have enabled us to bring distinguished scientists, historians, philosophers, and other analysts of science to lecture on issues of science in relationship to society. Bill Harris, who couldn't be here today, but sends regards, earned his bachelor's and master's degree from Caltech in mechanical engineering in 49 and 50. He's an active member of the Associates and the President's Circle at Caltech. He has always conveyed to us that his contact with humanities at the Institute in the 50s enriched his life immeasurably. Over the years, we've had the pleasure to host many outstanding scholars and public figures in the Harris Lectures. The Harris Endowment has made possible also the Einstein Centennial Distinguished Lecture Series in 2005 and again in 2015, and seminars jointly co-sponsored with the Beckman Institute, the Division of Biology, the Division of Engineering and Applied Science, and the Division of Physics, Mathematics, and Astronomy. Today's speaker, Dr. Andrew Shtulman, is currently chair of the Psychology Department at Occidental College. He received his undergraduate degree in psychology and his graduate degree in psychology from Princeton and Harvard University. He currently holds an 8-year James McDonnell Understanding Human Cognition Scholar Award and has received several NSF grants and awards. His areas of interest and expertise focus on the developmental and evolutionary aspects of beliefs in children and adults. One of his empirical studies that I found illuminating and also disturbing shows that many college students' scientific beliefs are qualitatively similar to their supernatural beliefs, despite self-perceptions to the contrary. He has also done research on magical thinking in the context of the explanatory structure of unexplainable events. Over the past weeks, Caltech's president and provost, together with faculty representatives from each division, have embarked on a long-term project designed to promote the public perception and public understanding of science. And therefore, we hope that today's Harris speaker will contribute to this enhanced dialogue on the Caltech campus, and I would like to extend a special welcome to undergraduate students who are present in the room and to the alumni who are present in the room, whom you can recognize by their orange lanyards. And I hope you can afterwards all join us for a little reception downstairs. Dr. Andrew Shtulman, my pleasure.
All right. Thank you for having me. So, hold on, let me just have a clock available so I don't go over time. All right, so I'm going to talk about science and how it conflicts with intuition, and how intuition is an impediment to learning science and accepting science and using science to inform our attitudes and our behaviors. It's probably no surprise to you that Americans are not big fans of science. Turns out it's really people in general who are not big fans of science. Americans are particularly hostile to science, but if you do polls of science understanding around the world, you see that it's really millions of people around the world who believe things that are just factually incorrect. So millions of people believe that dinosaurs coexisted with humans, even though dinosaurs actually died out 65 million years before humans emerged. Millions believe that the Earth's continents are fixed in place and do not move. Millions believe that there are different genes in different parts of the body as opposed to having the same genome in every cell of the body. People are confused about atomic structure, thinking that atoms are smaller than electrons rather than the other way around. And a full quarter of Americans believe that the sun revolves around the Earth rather than the other way around. So in addition to people being ignorant of science, they also tend to reject science. Millions of people deny that humans have evolved from non-human animals. Millions deny that humans have changed the climate and are continuing to change the climate. Millions deny that humans have walked on the moon. They deny that genetically modified foods are safe to eat and that vaccines are safe to receive. And then, of course, science is being politicized more and more these days. Here's a tweet from our president where he noted that a healthy young child goes to doctor, gets pumped with massive shot of many vaccines, doesn't feel good, and changes. Autism, many such cases. So what's going on? Why are so many people skeptical of knowledge that has transformed our society, brought us amazing technology, and so forth? The traditional answer is religion, that science has to compete with an alternative explanation for many of the world's events. Given that explanation already being in place, science doesn't have a shot. So for instance, in the domain of evolution, if we're concerned with the question of where did species come from, the scientific answer is that they derive from other species through descent with modification. But then there's this creationist alternative that species just appeared in existence as they are, and that's a very common explanation in many communities. And if you learn that as a child, then you already have an explanation for where species came from, and you're not open to other explanations. So there's lots of evidence that this is a true impediment to learning science, that the more religious you are, the more skeptical you are of science, and the more likely you are to misunderstand science. But today I actually want to focus on a different tension, not between science and religion, but between science and intuition. So within the domain of evolution still, here's another depiction of how species are interrelated, humans' interrelations with other primates. And as you can see very clearly here, the interrelations are through common ancestry. Humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor, and they in turn share a common ancestor with gorillas and so forth. But many people believe that humans are not related to chimps and other primates through common ancestry. They believe the relation is direct ancestry, that monkeys metamorphosed into apes, and apes metamorphosed into cavemen, and cavemen metamorphosed into humans. This idea is not supernatural in any way. It's not part of any religion, but it is opposed to science. The mechanisms that are evoked to explain evolution in the intuitive case are qualitatively different than the mechanisms that biologists use to explain the relations among species and the origin of species. So I'm going to focus on that tension today. I wrote a whole book about the topic. In this book, I go through 12 different domains of science and talk about the intuitive theories that we develop as children. Usually the intuitive theories are in place in the first decade of life, and how those conflict with scientific theories of the same phenomena. So I'm going to talk about some of those intuitive theories today. Intuitive theories is the technical term that psychologists give to the knowledge that's in place before we learn scientific theories. Psychologists have been studying how knowledge of the natural world is organized in the human mind for decades, starting with Jean Piaget. The discovery is that we don't just know a lot of isolated facts, sort of randomly organized in the brain. Those facts tend to be clustered into coherent networks of cause-effect beliefs. And they get the name intuitive just to contrast with other theories. They're the theories that we construct on our own, not totally independently with some support from the adults in our community, but they are constructed prior to formal education, so that's what makes them intuitive. And they get the term theory because they function similarly to scientific theories. They support explanations of things that happened in the past, predictions of things that will happen in the future. They help us intervene on the world in ways that will bring about the outcomes we desire. And they also support counterfactual reasoning. What would happen if some antecedent event had been different? So intuitive theories are always content specific. We don't just have general intuitive theories. We have intuitive theories of physical phenomena, in particular theories of matter, energy, gravity, motion, the cosmos, and the earth. We also have intuitive theories of biological phenomena like life, growth, inheritance, illness, adaptation, and ancestry. Pretty much in all domains of science, there is an intuitive theory in place before you learn the scientific theory. A scientist once told me that everything in science is counterintuitive, and I really do believe that. There are some psychologists who want to make the argument that there are some intuitive aspects of science, but usually the first theories that we develop, the ones that we would label intuitive, differ from scientific theories, not just quantitatively, but qualitatively. So I'm going to give you some examples coming up. First, though, I want to talk about where intuitive theories come from. So intuitive theories, like all knowledge, have three different sources. One source is evolution. Humans are born with some innate ideas about how the world works. Not a lot, but some. So for instance, in the domain of physics, we are born with expectations about objects, that objects are solid, they're cohesive, and they move on contact with other objects. And we know this through studies of infants. What you can do is you can create little magic events that you show infants, and you look to see whether or not they're surprised by the events. And surprise is registered by how long they look at the events. So for instance, if you show infants a fan that's moving back and forth on a stage, and then you put an object behind the fan, they will look longer if the fan appears to pass through the object, which you do with a trick apparatus. The object actually goes into the stage. They'll look longer at that event than an event where the fan stops when it would be making contact with the object, implying that infants do have expectations that objects are solid. Another source of input into the development of intuitive theories is firsthand experience, observing the world or interacting with the world. So one principle that is learned through experience that relates to objects is that objects have to be supported, otherwise they fall. It was possible that we would know this innately, but it turns out through experiments that infants actually learn this over the first year of life. So for instance, in a study depicted here, infants were shown a table on a stage, and a screen was raised to block the table, and then a ball was dropped behind the screen, and then the screen is lowered, and the infants see the ball sitting on the table. And the infant watches that event a few times, and once they're familiarized with the event, the table is taken away, and the ball is dropped, and the screen lowers, revealing either a ball on the stage or a ball floating in the air. Little, very young infants, 3-month-olds, I think even 6-month-olds, are not surprised to see the ball floating in the air. So that the understanding of gravity develops with actual experience dropping objects. And then the final input is culture. Many of the ideas that are spread through culture are true, facts about the world, but many are not. So around the world, it's a very common belief that if you are cold, that will cause you to catch a cold, but that is not actually true. It's germs that cause you to get a cold, and they survive better in cold air, but being cold itself is not going to cause you to catch a cold. So that brings me to the limitations of intuitive theories, which is the primary limitation is that they're wrong. I mean, if they weren't wrong, we wouldn't have scientific theories that ultimately eclipse them. And like I said before, they're not just factually wrong, they're wrong at a deep conceptual level. They carve up the world into entities and processes that don't actually exist as far as we understand the world to work today. A correlated limitation is that because we have the intuitive theory, the theories blind us to reality. They blind us to the way the world actually works. Not only when someone tells you about the scientific theory, but even just perceiving the world itself, we misperceive it to align with the intuitions we have. So intuitive theories have a series of hallmarks, And I'm going to just lay out the hallmarks briefly and then go through 2 case studies where I illustrate the hallmarks in the physical domain and in the biological domain. So one of the hallmarks is that intuitive theories are historically ancient. These are theories that children construct on their own, and depending on the particular theory, children have been constructing them as long as they've been thinking about the natural world. And if you look into the history of science, oftentimes the first theory that's formally articulated in a field corresponds to the theories that children today are constructing on their own, that are continually being reinvented one generation after the next. Intuitive theories are culturally universal because they all involve more or less the same inputs, evolution and experience. Usually the same ideas are hit upon regardless of your cultural upbringing. The culturally specific beliefs kind of round out the intuitive theories in different ways, but the differences are variations on the theme. The cores of the theories tend to be the same. They are resistant to counter-evidence, so the kinds of things that you can perceive yourself that positively contradict the intuitive theories often go unnoticed, or they get quarantined and ignored. Intuitive theories are resistant to counterinstruction as well. When students enter the science classroom with their intuitive theories, usually the instruction they receive contradicts those theories, but the contradictions are either not registered or the scientific information is assimilated into the intuitive theory in a way that it's not even accurate anymore. Intuitive theories lead to maladaptive attitudes and behaviors. We construct intuitive theories to help us explain and understand the world, so they're more helpful than they're not helpful, but they're most helpful in everyday situations that we encounter all the time. If you put people in new situations, those intuitive theories can lead them to behave maladaptively, and it can lead to maladaptive attitudes with respect to scientific topics. I think one of the most surprising things we've been learning about intuitive theories is they don't ever seem to be erased. That you can acquire a huge amount of scientific knowledge. You can be a professional working scientist, and there's still evidence that you harbor these intuitive theories somewhere in the recesses of your mind. All right, so I wanted to illustrate these points first with the case study of projectile motion. So here we have a person being shot from a cannon, and at each point in this trajectory, the only force that's acting on the person is gravity. As soon as the projectile is airborne, it's only gravity that's operating. And the reason why the projectiles trace parabolic paths is because gravity, in combination with the horizontal velocity that the object has, creates that kind of path. Most people, though, don't think about motion in those terms. They instead think about motion in terms of what's known in the literature as an impetus. So the idea is that objects are at rest until they're set in motion by a force, and that external force, say a push or a pull, is actually transferred into the object. And when it's inside the object, it's now become an impetus that keeps the object moving until the impetus either dissipates on its own or it's overcome by some other force like friction or gravity. Everybody knows that gravity is operating on objects in the world. Like this coin, gravity is always pulling it down. But to explain why it moves and why it seems to move upward, even though gravity is pulling it down, people posit this internal force, the impetus. And the idea is that as soon as the object is set in motion, it has an impetus that's larger than gravity, and thus it can move upward. And then maybe at the peak of the trajectory, impetus and gravity are balanced. And then it begins to fall as impetus is depleted and is weaker than the force of gravity. That's the intuitive view. So we see historical antecedents of this when we look to the history of physics. In the Middle Ages, there were many explicit impetus theorists. So here's a drawing by one of these impetus theorists where this person is analyzing the trajectories of a cannon shot from a cannonball. So at point A, the cannonball has been imparted with the impetus. That's what keeps it moving until it gets to C, where now the impetus has depleted enough that gravity will take it down. And at some point over here, D, it has lost all of its impetus and it will fall straight down. So this is how physicists before Newton explained motion, and it caused them to actually misperceive motion, because these people had seen cannonballs fired and they would never trace that particular path. They would trace a parabolic path, but nonetheless, when people reconstructed the paths on paper, they misremember having seen them fall straight down at some point in their trajectory. Here's a snippet from Galileo's De Motu on motion, where he explicitly articulates an impetus view. So he says he's explaining motion in this way. The body moves upward, projectile motion. The body moves upward provided the impressed motive force is greater than the resisting weight. But since that force is continually weakened, it will finally become so diminished that it will no longer overcome the weight of the body. All right, so fast forward to today, you can see evidence of impetus theory around the world. One common way to diagnose impetus theory is by asking people to draw the trajectories of objects that are in motion. So, for instance, this rat being carried by an owl, where will the rat go when the owl releases it? Or this ball that's about to roll off a table, where will it go? And all people have to do is just draw the path. And in reality, they're going to follow parabolic paths. That's the solid line. But many people think the rat will fall straight down. They don't actually attribute any impetus to the rat because it was being carried. So it's just gravity that's going to pull it straight down. Some people think it might fly backwards. With the ball, they think it will fall straight down near the end of its trajectory, but because it's rolling off the table, it clearly has impetus, so it will move outward before it falls straight down. Some people even think it will move straight out, so for some amount of time, if it's moving fast enough, its impetus will totally overpower gravity, similar to how Wile E. Coyote remains aloft before falling straight down. People actually draw these trajectories. And you see this no matter who you ask to do it. So these results have been replicated in China, Mexico, Turkey, Israel, the Ukraine, Philippines, the US, all sorts of places. Here's another task that diagnoses impetus theory. You tell people about an object that's being spun on a string around someone's head, and you're told that if the string breaks at that point, where will the ball fly? So in reality, it will fly in a straight path tangent to the curve at the point that it's released, but many people think it will remain moving in a curved path. Not as much of a curve, but it's acquired a curved impetus through the motion, the action that set it in motion. The same thing is happening over here, but you just tell people about a ball shot through a curved tube, and they think that it will remain moving in a curve rather than shoot out of the tube in a straight path. And you see that happen, those kinds of paths drawn all over the place. Counterevidence. So objects don't actually follow these trajectories. Another place where the evidence of your eyes doesn't align with intuitive theories is watching objects fall. So heavy objects are believed to fall faster than light objects because the weight of the object gives it some extra impetus relative to the light one. And you can set up experiments, and many physics teachers do, where you have students drop heavy and light objects and measure how quickly they fall, or roll them down a ramp, which is analogous. And students can do this over and over again, varying nothing but the weight of the ball, but they still walk away from the experiments thinking that heavy objects fall faster than light ones. One study was done where students watched a video of a ball being shot through a curved tube. And of course, it exits the tube in a straight path. And they watch this happen, and then they're asked to draw the trajectory of the path they just witnessed. And they still draw curved paths. So misremembering what they had just seen. If you explicitly try to instruct people on the correct theory, there's many ways in which instruction goes awry. There's good curricula out there, but the most common thing that physics professors or teachers do is to have their students solve many physics problems in the context of a problem set. And what happens when you do this is you become very good at mapping equations to situations and realizing which values get plugged into which variables in the equation, but it doesn't change their students' qualitative understanding of motion. So in one study, they looked at how well students understood motion using a qualitative measure of motion, which is what's graphed on the y-axis, as a function of how many problems they had solved in problem sets. And there was no correlation between the two. So students who had solved nearly 3,000 physics problems had no better understanding of motion than those who solved only 300. Maybe you're thinking problem sets are just not the right instruction. Students need to do something more interactive. So there was a study done looking at the effect of interacting with objects in virtual worlds, where the worlds are set up to obey the laws of physics, and you manipulate objects and set objects in motion. So here's a screenshot from one such virtual world, the game Enigmo, where your task is to direct little water droplets into a vesicle, and you manipulate these drums, and they bounce off the drums, and the water droplets trace parabolic paths. And so after students played this game for 6 hours, they then, well, before and after, they took a test of their qualitative understanding of motion, where they drew the trajectories of objects, test items like those. And what they found is that students who played Enigma for 6 hours did not improve on this test any more than students who played a non-physics game for 6 hours. Maladaptive consequences. Intuitive theories can lead us to interact with objects in maladaptive ways. So in one task, students were given a ball and they had to walk briskly past a trash can. And they needed to get the ball into the trash can, but they couldn't throw it. They just had to release it. And the way to actually get the ball in the trash can is to release it before you get to the trash can, because it's going to fall in a parabolic path. But many students released it directly over the trash can and overshot the target, assuming that it would fall straight down. In this task, the students were asked to shoot a hockey puck through a macaroni-shaped tube, and the correct way to do it is illustrated there on the right, where you just shoot it on a straight path through the center there. But many students try to impart a curved force to the puck by curving it as they set it in motion. And then it just hits the inside of the tube and doesn't go through. So this intuitive theory still seems to be present even in people who have acquired lots of physics knowledge, such as physics professors. So there was one, or physicists. There was one study done where they put physicists in an fMRI scanner to measure brain activity while they watched objects fall. And they had different pairings of objects, but in the critical pairings, there was a heavy object and a light object. The heaviness was conveyed by the size of the object. And they had to say whether or not the event they were watching was accurate or inaccurate. So critically, they needed to say that the heavy object and the light object would hit the ground at the same point. And in cases where they didn't hit the ground at the same point, they would say that's inaccurate. So the physicists did very well on this task. I think they were 100% correct. But their brains were being scanned while they did it. And the brain scanning data revealed evidence of internal conflict. There are two areas of the brain that were particularly active: the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex up there at the top, and the anterior cingulate cortex highlighted at the bottom. And those are areas that are involved in error monitoring and inhibitory control, which implies that in order for the physicists to produce the correct response, they had to inhibit the misconception that heavy objects fall faster than light ones. All right, so moving to a different domain, I wanted to talk about the phenomenon of biological adaptation and our explanations for that. So here we have 4 species of finches. These are actually drawings that came from Darwin's voyage to the Galapagos, where he discovered that the finches on the different islands of the Galapagos were adapted to their environments in different ways. And ultimately, we now understand adaptation as a process of selective survival and selective reproduction, where there's a population of finches, different populations on different islands, and only some of the finches survive and reproduce, and the traits that those ones have will spread through the population. So that's the scientific explanation for adaptation. The process is evolution by natural selection, and to put a finer point on it, I want to illustrate it in this context here, which we'll come back later when I talk about tasks that people are asked to do to measure their understanding. So if a biologist were to observe a species of moth that seemed to be getting darker over time, the way a biologist would explain this is through selection and mutation. These moths here that are circled are the ones that are selected in the sense that they were the only ones that survived to reproduce. And they have offspring that tend to resemble themselves, but sometimes there are mutations. And if those mutations lead to greater survival and greater reproduction, they'll spread throughout the population. So this is not the intuitive theory of evolution, of course. Intuitively, people look at this kind of data and ignore the variation within a population, thinking that that's inconsequential, and focus instead on the average moth, the essential moth. Since the moth species as a whole is evolving, the idea is that there's something about the moth's nature that's changing over time. So people explain evolution not in terms of a population changing, but in terms of these types or units that are evolving over time. So there's historical antecedents for this view. The most famous one is Lamarck's theory of evolution, but and Lamarck proposed this theory many years before Darwin, but when Darwin was proposing his theory, he had many contemporaries like Cope and Haeckel who also proposed theories of evolution that were qualitatively different from the selection-based theory that Darwin ultimately proposed. So Lamarck's theory was one of the inheritance of acquired characters. So the prototypical story is of a giraffe striving to reach leaves on a higher branch by stretching its neck, which results in slightly longer necks, and a slightly longer neck is passed from parent to offspring. So this is a particular mechanism that Lamarck used to explain evolution, but all the mechanisms posited before Darwin were of the same nature in that they assume that all members of the species are evolving together, as opposed to variation within a population and selection over the population. The thought was all the organisms are having offspring more adapted to the environment than the parents were for whatever mechanism was proposed. Mutation and selection played no role in that theory. So today you can see that when people think about evolution, they also think about it in this holistic manner. It's basically akin to metamorphosis. All the members of the species are just metamorphosizing and becoming better adapted to the environment. So one task that's been used to diagnose this is a task that I've developed where we tell people about the Industrial Revolution, pumping pollution into the environment and making the trees and the environment darker. And there's a species of moss that eventually became darker during the same time period. If a biologist went out into the English countryside for 25 years over the course of this change and gathered a sample, what would those samples look like? So then participants were shaded in the moss however they wanted to depict the change unfolding over time. So some people produced this pattern, which we would code as biologically correct, where you show some darker mutants that are spreading, mutations spreading throughout the population. But most people produce something like this, where they depict no variation within a population at any given time. All the variation is happening between generations. So, I mean, it's basically the essence of the moth that's changing, and the fact that there's multiple representations doesn't really matter. You can just take one column, and that well describes how people think about the evolutionary process. So this particular task hasn't been done all over the world, but tasks like it have. And you see people in the US, the UK, Italy, Belgium, Greece, Israel, Turkey. They're all thinking about evolution as this holistic, essentialist transformation because they're thinking about the essence of the species changing over time. So that's thinking about evolution at a micro level. At a macro level, you also see similar misconceptions across cultures where people don't like to think about evolution in terms of branching relationships. They like to think about it as this linear metamorphosis, the essence that's changing. So if you ask people about whether or not humans are related to other species, Many think that humans are not related to other species or related only to a few species. And if they are related to a few species, the relation is something like that on the right, where the species evolved in this linear transformative way. So we don't see evolution unfold before our eyes very often. It's hard to witness evolution in action, but we see the prerequisites for evolution all over the place, and we underestimate and underappreciate those. So one prerequisite is variation within a population. And humans tend to underappreciate and underestimate variation because we focus so much on the essential form. Dog shows are a great example of this, where rather than appreciate differences within a breed, we're trying to find the one dog that best epitomizes the breed, that embodies the essence of the breed. So variation within a population is necessary. Selection is necessary as well. And again, when we see selection happening, we tend to think that's unusual and not at all typical of the biological world. One great recent example of this are the bird cams that have been located in osprey nests and bald eagle nests. People can log on to websites and watch the birds and their hatchlings. And what's discovered is infanticide and siblicide, because bald eagles regularly kill weak offspring. And then there's comments that follow the webcams where people rail about the injustice. So, for instance, one person commenting on one bird cam said, I, for one, will not stop fighting to get the hatchling removed from this nest. Shame on all involved. Someone else wrote, it is absolutely disgusting that you will not take those chicks away from that demented witch of a parent. But of course, there's nothing wrong with that particular eagle. That's how eagles operate. That's selection in action. So if you explicitly try to teach people about evolution, the result is usually a lack of success. So here's some data from a study that I conducted where it was what we're looking at is pre-test data. These are students who are about to take a college-level biology class, and we had a measure of their understanding of evolution that ranged from -30 to +30. Negative scores indicated misconceptions that were aligned with the intuitive theory, and positive scores correct conceptions. So they hadn't yet taken the class, but the students had taken high school biology. These are all college students. So they had had an average of 2 years of high school biology, but they still had very strong misconceptions about how evolution worked. And then after the class, they still had misconceptions. Most students did not change their scores, statistically speaking. 4/5 of students showed no significant movement after a whole semester of biology in which evolution was explicitly covered. With respect to maladaptive consequences, the behavioral consequences of intuitive theories of evolution have not been studied at all, to my knowledge, but there's a lot of consequences with respect to attitudes. So you might have seen this graph before. This is a 40 industrialized nation and the extent to which they accept evolution. So the blue bars correspond to acceptance, the red bars rejection, and the tan bars ambivalence. And America is down here, second to the bottom. Most Americans reject evolution, or at least they don't accept evolution. And it turns out that there's lots of reasons why this is the case. I mean, one reason is that Americans tend to be very religious, particularly conservatively religious. But part of the rejection is motivated by misunderstanding evolution. There's reliable correlations between how you understand evolution and whether you accept it as true. So if you hold intuitive theories of evolution, you tend to reject that evolution actually occurs. And you see that these attitudes are very stable. Gallup has been polling the American public for over 40 years about their beliefs in evolution. The line at the bottom is really the only line that corresponds to acceptance of evolution. It is man developed, but God had no part in the process. The top line is a creationist endorsement, and the next line is a theistic evolution endorsement, where they concede that humans have changed, but say that God guided the process. So the numbers have only increased by 10% over the last 40 years in terms of acceptance of evolution without any divine intervention. And then with respect to the apparent permanence of these theories, I wanted to involve you in a little task. So I imagine many of you, perhaps all of you, understand how evolution works. So I'm going to ask you some true or false questions about humans evolution, and I want you to respond true or false in your head as quickly as possible. Number 1, humans are descended from tree-dwelling creatures. 2, humans are descended from plants. 3, humans are descended from chimpanzees. 4, humans are descended from sea-dwelling creatures. All right, so those are the correct answers. They've been designed to be analogous in the conceptual relations we're at. They're all about humans descending from something. They've also been designed so half of them are true and half of them are false. And they've also been designed as to whether or not they conflict with intuitive theories of evolution. So statements 1 and 2 are consistent with intuitive theories of evolution. In this case, the relevant part of the theory is that we evolved directly from chimpanzees. And then 3 and 4 are inconsistent. So if we just focus on the true statements, if intuitively we're thinking that humans descended from chimpanzees, then we should easily accept that humans descended from tree-dwelling creatures, and it should be harder for us to accept that humans descended from sea-dwelling creatures. With respect to the false statements, it should be easy for us to reject that humans descended from plants because plants and chimps are totally different, but it should be slightly harder for us to reject that humans evolved from chimpanzees if that's our gut reaction that we have to inhibit. And sure enough, what you see when you give these tasks to people who understand how evolution works on a paper and pencil test where you're given as much time as you need to complete the test, you see that people are less accurate for the statements that are inconsistent with intuition, and they're slower on those statements as well. And I want to digress a little bit to talk about this finding in general before wrapping it all up, because I think this is one of the most fascinating things about intuitive theories. So when you learn science, it shouldn't really matter whether those scientific ideas are consistent or inconsistent with intuitive theories if the scientific theory replaces the intuitive theory and erases it from our minds. But what you see from one domain to the next is that in cases where science and intuition conflict, people are less accurate when responding to those ideas, verifying those ideas, and they're slower to verify them, even when they get them correct. So this pattern has been seen not just in the domain of evolution, but in 10 different domains of science and more in other studies. So here's data from one study where evolution's on the leftmost side, but we looked at other domains of science to the right of evolution. And what we're looking here is how accurately people respond to scientific statements as a function of whether they are consistent with intuitive theories or inconsistent. And when they're consistent, people are more accurate at verifying the statements than when they're inconsistent. And then if you focus just on the cases where they are correct in their verifications, and you look to see how quickly it took them to make those verifications, consistency with intuition matters once again. So when the theories are consistent with intuition, people verify those statements more quickly than when they are inconsistent with intuition. And these are in all kinds of domains for which we learn the relevant scientific theory quite early in life, such as matter and life. It's usually in the elementary school years that you develop scientific theories of matter. But the intuitive theories still seem to be there, causing conflict. This phenomenon has been observed in many populations. So it's been observed in middle schoolers who are just learning science, a lot of science, in high schoolers who've learned more science, in college undergraduates, including science majors. It's been observed in elderly adults who haven't had science for a while, but they've had ample time to let the science sink in, so to speak, to allow the scientific knowledge, to consolidate the scientific knowledge, and to use the scientific knowledge to explain and predict the world since they first learned that knowledge. But the intuitive theories still seem to be there. You see it in science teachers, and you also see it in professional scientists. Science professors are way more accurate than their undergraduates in terms of verifying these statements, but they're still slower to verify intuition inconsistent statements relative to intuition consistent ones, even within their own domain of science. So like a biologist verifying biological statements or a physicist verifying physical statements. So these kinds of findings, I think, have motivated a new metaphor for understanding what happens when we learn science. The predominant metaphor for 30 years of research in this area has been restructuring. And the idea is that you take an intuitive theory that has certain concepts in it, that assumes there are certain entities that exist and certain processes that exist, and then you collapse distinctions and you make new distinctions, and you're ultimately restructuring the theory. So in the end, you have your scientific theory, which is a well-restructured version of the earlier theory. But if that were true, then there should be no remnants of the earlier theory available. Once it's been restructured, all those earlier ideas should be erased. In the same way that if you restructured your house by knocking down some walls and building new walls, there'd be no evidence of the earlier floor plan. So these findings about the coexistence of science and intuition suggest that a better way of thinking about learning science is that we're creating a palimpsest. So palimpsests are these medieval documents. Well, they don't have to be, but they're very common in the Middle Ages when monks were transcribing important documents and paper was scarce. So if they needed to make a new transcription, they would go to older documents that they didn't need anymore and try to scratch off the ink and then inscribe the new text on top. But usually you could still read the earlier transcription underneath the later transcription. And so in the same way, intuitive theories seem to remain etched beneath scientific theories. The scientific theories might be more prominent. They might be the first theory that you consult when you're reasoning about the domain. But if adults are put under time pressure or they're burdened in some way, they'll often resort to the intuitive theory, which seems to be etched there under the surface. All right, so these kinds of findings, the findings that A, we hold intuitive theories of scientific phenomena, and B, the intuitive theories never really seem to be erased, have important implications for science education. So one implication that has been well accepted by science teachers now, I think the message has been spread, which is that students are not blank slates when they enter the science classroom. They have pre-existing ideas about how this domain functions, what exists within the domain. And some of the best instruction happens when you get students to articulate those ideas, and then the instructor shows how the intuitive ideas are inconsistent with the scientific ideas. If you just introduce the scientific ideas, chances are that they will be misunderstood, ignored, or assimilated into the intuitive theory in a way where you think you've learned what's on offer, but you really haven't. A great example of that in physics is the term momentum. Students very readily map momentum onto impetus. And so they maintain their impetus theory, but now they talk about impetus as momentum. They've learned the word for that force they've always believed in. I think there are a separate set of implications that come from the fact that intuitive theories are never fully erased, which is that teachers should recognize that when students leave the science classroom, they're going to be in situations where both an intuitive idea and a scientific idea are brought to mind. And there's going to be conflict between the two. And so it's potentially useful to get students to recognize when those conflicts might occur and to somehow privilege the science-based attitudes and beliefs and behaviors over the intuitive ones, though it would be difficult to predict all the cases where those kinds of conflicts would arise. But what I want to end with is not just implications for education, but implications for living in general. Intuitive theories, I think, have widespread implications for how we function in society, implications for health, wealth, and well-being. There's lots of cases where we have to make decisions about what to buy or what to invest in, where intuition seems to be a poor guide because our intuitive theories are going to lead us to make the wrong decisions. And so some examples of that are whether or not to be genetically tested or how to interpret the tests, whether or not to engage in gene therapy, what kinds of fertility treatments to undertake, whether or not to consume pasteurized foods, or, well, the default is to consume them, but whether or not to consume raw foods that would otherwise be pasteurized, and whether or not to purchase and consume genetically modified foods. Here's a great illustration of how our intuitions lead us astray when it comes to GMOs. Here's a bottle of salt that's been labeled non-GMO, which is ridiculous because salt is inorganic, so it has no genes, and thus it couldn't be genetically modified. When it comes to health behavior, intuition, once again, is a poor guide for making decisions about health in lots of areas. Whether or not to get vaccinated. We've seen a resurgence of measles. Measles have been declared eradicated from the US, but in 2014 there were large outbreaks because people were no longer getting their children vaccinated because vaccines seemed wrong. Why would you inject chemicals into a child? Whether or not to use antibiotics, or to what extent you use antibiotics, how to lose weight, whether or not to donate organs, and how to avoid infectious disease. With respect to the latter, here's a poster that was produced by healthcare workers in Africa, where their mission, or their task in educating the African population that's been ravaged by AIDS is twofold. Not only do they have to teach the people they work with the biological mechanisms of HIV transmission and how that manifests itself in AIDS, but also unteach the idea that AIDS is caused by witchcraft. Witchcraft is it's magical, but it's also more intuitive, because it's intuitive to think that there are certain people out there that you might offend and thus will be intent on doing you harm. It's much less intuitive to think about disease in terms of an invisible microscopic organism that has invaded your body and is now replicating inside the body. And then finally, with respect to public policy, intuition again is a poor guide for making decisions about things like whether or not we should teach children about evolution, or at what age we should teach children about evolution, whether or not we should engage in stem cell research, whether we should clone organisms, genetic engineering with respect to foods, but also with respect to crops, livestock, and so forth, and climate change. What can be done about climate change, and even just whether we should accept climate change as happening. Here's a stunt to illustrate the last point that was pulled off by Senator James Inhofe, where he brought a snowball onto the floor of the Senate as an proof against climate change. And his argument was, it's cold outside, it's snowing. If there's snow outside, the Earth's climate can't possibly be getting warmer. So here he's conflating weather and climate, but that kind of conflation is enough for people to just flat out reject climate change as occurring. All right, so to conclude, Galileo once said that all truths are easy to understand once they are discovered. The point is to discover them. And I would say that psychologists have positively refuted Galileo at this point by documenting many truths that are not easy to understand. And they're not easy to understand because they defy some of our deepest intuitions about how the world works, intuitions that emerge early in development and are easily accessed throughout the lifespan. And so if we want to have a more productive economy, a more healthful society, and a more livable environment, we have to address those intuitive theories. All right, so I will end there and open it up to questions. Yeah?
Do you cringe when you hear the phrase intuitively obvious?
No, but I mean, maybe I should. There's some redundancy there. Some intuitive theories are not so obvious. Like intuitive theories of evolution, I don't think we would develop those on our own if we didn't live in a culture that knew about evolution and depicted evolution in science textbooks, science museums, but also popular culture. You see Pokemon evolving. These are theories that we develop because we're trying to make sense of what the culture at large is talking about when they're talking about evolution, but it's not obvious that evolution occurs at all. if you just look at the biological world.
Yes.
So I guess this might be kind of hard to test, but is there any evidence that we get better at this over time, like over age? So once we've been taught about counterintuitive ideas, then you get presented with a new counterintuitive idea, do you learn it quicker?
Oh, right. Well, certainly there's going to be like some foundational scientific concepts that once in place will help you acquire other scientific concepts. Yeah, so I think even though all of science is counterintuitive, you can't start with the higher level concepts. You're going to need to learn some of the more foundational ones. But I don't think necessarily, if the higher level ones are counterintuitive, they'll still remain counterintuitive. I think a deeper question is whether or not you can get better at accessing scientific ideas. You would think that professional scientists would have science on the top of their minds rather than intuition. And I think that's probably right in the context of their work. When you're in the lab, when you're at a conference, when you're writing a paper, you really are thinking scientifically. But it's outside those contexts where sometimes it's easy to get tripped up and default to the intuitive theories that you developed as children before you even knew anything about science.
Question on the left there.
Critical idea with the data for all of us is that there is this competition between intuition and this intuition of what you learn. A lot of the data at face value can be interpreted in a slightly different way, which is that when you put the science cap, you have to answer one of those tests. If you are a scientist, for example, you know scientific the leader is thinking. It's just that some of your questions are harder than others, or more ambiguous than others, and you are more likely to make mistakes, or it takes longer to process the ones that are harder. And those basically hardness, how difficult they are, seems also correlated with natural, the way you classify that natural intuitive. How do you rule that out?
Well, I mean, one thing, if you're going to go that route, you have to explain what makes it harder. And I think that in many cases, hard is just going to end up being equivalent to counterintuitive. But
according to scientists, there is really a competing intuition. It's a very powerful idea that you're proposing, very, very powerful intuition implications for all of us. That you are loading, I give you one of these questions, or I have to decide about one of these policy things. I'm loading up in my head, in consciously perhaps, an intuition that is wrong, and then I have to keep. That is the idea that is so powerful. But if the data is compatible with alternative theory because of the way the questions are constructed, that maybe there's no competition, it's just that the questions that are more likely to make mistakes or take longer are those that require more steps of deductive thinking and therefore more likely to generate mistakes. Then it's a very different implication.
Right. Well, but we're not starting from scratch in terms of defining something as counterintuitive because there's 40 years of research characterizing intuitive theories in children. So if you look at how children are understanding scientific domains, you can construct items that basically are ones children should get right because this is how they think about the domain, and these ones they should get wrong because even though this is scientifically correct, intuitively, this doesn't make sense in terms of the theories they've constructed. But regardless of that point, there's lots of evidence from different angles that all suggest that intuitive theories are still there. I think the best evidence comes from looking at Alzheimer's patients, where you're not putting them under time pressure or under cognitive load. You're just asking them scientific questions, basically. And what you find is that they default to the intuitive theories that you don't see explicitly endorsed by anyone other than children. So an example of this is what's alive? If you ask children whether various things are alive, like animals, plants, living things that move on their own, like the sun, they default to motion. So they'll say plants are not alive because they don't move, and the sun is alive because it's moving on its own. And then they learn that life actually corresponds to metabolic functioning, and you don't see these misconceptions until you then look at Alzheimer's patients who will very happily tell you the sun is alive and plants are not alive. And it's not just being old, because elderly adults who are matched for age but don't have Alzheimer's respond the way that younger adults do and the way that kids do after they learn the correct theory. So reverting to the earlier response pattern is some evidence that it's still there.
Chris and then Frederick.
So is there, in the case of the scientists who still have traces of this, is there any evidence of framing effects? Like if somehow they think of it as just an everyday problem, they'll resort to the intuitive module, but if you cue them, this is a scientific problem, they'll use what they've learned in science, so that, as it were, it's almost as if they got two modules, and you know, one may or may not be triggered by the framework of a problem you give them.
I think that's a great question. I don't think we have any studies that have addressed it. These kinds of data on the coexistence of science and intuition are relatively new. It's only within the last 10 years that people have been looking at this, because the assumption had always been, once you've learned science, you've erased the earlier theories. Even though that couldn't quite be right, because how could we understand certain words that rely on intuitive theories for their meaning, like sunrise and sunset? As soon as you learn that the day-night cycle is caused by the movement of the Earth, suddenly sunrise and sunset should make no sense anymore, right? It should be sun occlusion and sun accretion. And you should say, like, I just don't understand what you're talking about. But the fact that we retain an understanding of sunrise and sunset implies that some aspect of the intuitive theory is still there to make sense of the observation of the sun moving and the terms we use. So when people have delved into this, the first demonstration was just with scientifically literate adults, college undergraduates. But then people have been pushing the barrier. Well, can we see this in science teachers? Can we see this in professional scientists? Now that we know we see it everywhere, that's a good question as to, are there contextual factors that can lead people to respond more accurately and not show the effect?
It won't work for all of your examples, but at least for some it seems like the correct physics that I learn is idealized for the setting, and so the correct physics that I might apply in my everyday life wouldn't give me correct results because, you know, I'm missing friction or something like that. So to what extent does idealization in the correct physical theory play a role in these types of results? That you have a divergence between intuition, which will work quite well in everyday life.
So are you thinking that a person could respond incorrectly to one of these physics prompts because they are taking an idealized view of the situation?
No, the other way around. I don't reach for the science because the science is incorrect because it's idealized for the simple case that I'm looking at.
So you...
So I drop a feather and a ball.
Yeah.
They should arrive at the same time.
Oh, but they don't in the air. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, in the particular task where you ask people whether objects fall at the same rate, you tell them we're talking about within a vacuum. I mean, so you try to know the science well enough to block those kinds of objections. I don't do work in physics, so I'm not exactly sure how well people have thought through the materials, but definitely in the domain of evolution. That's where I've done my work. I've tried to block objections that might come from someone with higher level understanding. And what you see is like maybe some of the responses could be a result of people knowing too much, but there are certain basic responses that anyone who knows anything about evolution should not give you, even under an idealized version of the task or the situation.
Please.
You said there were different sources for intuitive theories. What if we acted on what's friends and act on experience and culture?
Mm-hmm.
Would it help establish intuitive theories that correspond to scientific theories?
Oh, the theories respond to a single source? No, most theories are going to be built up from information that comes from all three sources, but some theories are more reliant on one source of information than others. So intuitive theories of evolution probably have little to no grounding in evolution, in innate concepts, and not a lot of grounding in experience, although we do interact with the biological world in ways that would lead us to maybe underestimate variation within a species or so forth. A lot of the fodder for an intuitive theory of evolution is going to come from cultural input, looking at how evolution is depicted, listening to people talk about it, and so forth. On the other hand, intuitive theories of motion are probably going to be very strongly grounded in firsthand experiences interacting with physical objects. Bizarrely enough, though, you'll never see an object, a projectile fall straight down. So even though we are interacting with objects and observing them move, the interaction is still biased. Yeah, there's a different story to be told about every intuitive theory. And so I think that was what was so much fun about writing my book, because I could focus from one domain to the next on where did that theory come from and what are the primary sources of information that lead you to adopt this theory as opposed to a more correct view of the world.
Carol, what about scientific areas that are not fully developed or understood, like steps?
So are you asking, like, would people?
How do people come to the edge of being scientific, but they can't go any further because there's not enough known yet?
Right.
Do they start mixing
Do they start
the intuitive theories? Do they help make progress in that stage, or they all that?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a question for how do scientists grapple with the frontiers of science, and then there's a question about how does the non-scientist who's learning about the frontiers of science understand those developments. And I think the non-scientist is probably totally clueless. Someone recently asked me, where's the literature on intuitive theories of quantum mechanics? And I was like, I don't think any exists, because I don't think any lay people even know the word quantum. So they haven't developed a theory at all, because you develop the intuitive theories for making sense of the things you have to deal with. The events you're going to be part of, the objects you're going to encounter, the things you hear people say. On the other hand, when it comes to scientists, they probably are not relying on intuition very much now at the frontiers of science, because the earlier work has taken you away from intuition, that you're now relying on a thoroughly scientific foundation. Nevertheless, there's people get ideas from all sorts of places, and so certain metaphors that you bring in to understand the topic might be grounded in intuition, for good or for bad.
Sorry, just real quick point. I think there's a lot of kind of ad hoc connectionism going on between mysticism and quantum mechanics now.
Yeah, right.
And I was watching the movie Bull Durham recently, and it kept coming up. But there have also been books like the Tao of Physics, where Fritjof Capra, that's how I pronounce his name, was sort of looking at Eastern religious traditions and mysticism and sort of emerging modern physics, finding parallels. I think there's still an intuition there.
Yeah, no, that's a great example, actually. I mean, I think the average person just doesn't know anything about quantum mechanics and thus is not going to make the connection. But someone who has at least some level of knowledge can then start branching out and making these analogies. Yeah.
We'll take one more question. Thank you. Please.
I wanted to ask about ways of combating or more fully letting go of intuitive theories. You talked a little bit about it being helpful for teachers to begin classes by sort of acknowledging the intuitive theories that students come in with and then maybe working on breaking them down. I was wondering whether you have any other examples or knowing about the literature sort of replacing intuitive theories and how teachers can do it, like in the classroom, but also how parents and other sort of cultural inputs can help with that.
Right. So in my book, I try to highlight effective teaching strategies whenever I can. I mean, there are many that have been developed, and there's kind of, I guess, two ways of going about bypassing the intuitive theory or working with the, those are the two ways. You can try to bypass it or work with it. So the bypassing approach is where you try to show students that their intuitive theories are qualitatively different from the scientific theory, and you try to put in place this abstract structure that corresponds to the scientific theory, and then you fill in the details. So to be more specific, emergent processes that's a framework that can account for lots of scientific phenomena, like heat, or diffusion, or consciousness, or there's lots of things that you can describe as emergent processes. And you can sketch out what an emergent process is, how you have lower levels and higher levels of a system, and so forth. And then you fill in the details with respect to the content you want to teach. And so you're not really making contact with the intuitive theory other than to show that we're not talking about heat as a substance, because I know that's how you intuitively think about heat, as something that flows in and out of objects. We're talking about heat as an emergent process. On the other hand, so that works, but another strategy that works too is by explicitly trying to bridge the two, all the while as you're making these connections, you're moving further and further from the intuitive theory. So you find something in the intuitive theory that genuinely does map onto a correct understanding. So a good example of this is the normal force in physics. That's very counterintuitive, that the floor could be pushing up on me, because it doesn't feel like the floor is exerting a force. But people intuitively understand that when you push down a spring is pushing up on your hand. And so you can then try to analogize that to other objects that have some palpable push to them, like styrofoam or pliable material. You kind of move from springs to something a little more solid to something a little more solid until you finally get to a book on a table. And you've tried to, through that process, induce an idea that there is this upward pushing force. Yeah, in both cases, you are acknowledging the intuitive theory, but you're kind of dealing with it in different ways. You're bypassing it or making bridges to it.